The local candidates debate, we covered it.
How about the 4th of July parade, town festivals, or those great weekly concerts in the park? You can catch full coverage of your town's events on PEG Access Channel.
PEG? Well, it stands for Public Education and Government. PEG Media Centers are usually managed by a city, school district, a nonprofit, or a university where students learn the basics of television production.
Many PEG Media Centers invite the community to learn television production
and produce their own shows.
That's public access, so you can produce a show about an issue that matters to you.
How about a talk show on the best bike routes around your town?
or a show about Main Street businesses.
You can use your PEG channel to air your child's soccer games.
City by city, every town is different, and every community media center is different.
What would you like to see?
Contact your local PEG Media Center.
Strong media centers, strong communities.
Oregon Community Access, community is our middle name.
Happy says watch OCA Media.
You're there for them. We're here for you. Find free care guides at aarp.org/caregiving.
We would never hit 12 drunk. Never send it drunk. Do a stoppie drunk. We would never drift drunk. So you should never drive drunk. Drive sober or get pulled over.
Roll over. Chance high five. All right. When you adopt a shelter pet, you discover all the things that make them unique. And your mother and... I am totally a hot person. Right, guys? Thanks for being honest. They're a little bit of a lot of things, but they're all pure love. Adopt pure love at theshelterpetproject.org.
coming up. In the next couple weeks, I was telling some folks before, we have a native seed starting for winter sowing next week here. Well, I think we'll probably be in the room there. So we have that next week. We have another author event the week after that. That one is online, and you get a free watercolor kit. So if you're interested in that, that should be a good one as well. You can always check out our calendar. We have lots of stuff going on all the time for all ages, including adults. Often in libraries, people forget that there's stuff for adults too. So there's lots of fun things going on. Just waiting. Okay, action, he said it. All right, welcome tonight. My name's Kara, and I am the Adult Services Librarian next door at the library. Tonight, I'm so happy to have Nina here with us to talk about her book and her experiences and all of that. So for folks here in the room, if you could make sure that your phones are on silent or off, that will be helpful. And then folks joining us from online, you can ask questions using the chat in YouTube, or you can email me. And I'll relay your questions to Nina towards the end. So, take it away.
Thank you so much. I'll give you my full name. It's Nina Lewandowska Camic. And I am really happy to see all of you here. When Kara cornered me during the summer to do this presentation in January, I said, oh, sure, yeah, I'll be there. And then as the weather got worse and winter came on, I thought, who the heck is going to drive up to see me talk in person at Oregon Public Library? So, and then I read this incredibly funny and sincere story about this author who was also promoting her first book, and she went to a book reading, and two people showed up, and one was her aunt, and one was a person who went to the wrong room. And she got a whole flood of people commiserating with her, including very famous authors like Atwood and others who wrote, "We've all been through this, you come, and at most your aunt will show up, don't worry about it. You're not going to be a published author until you have the empty room before you." So I was fully prepared for that, and I'm so happy that I don't have to speak just to Kara and to my aunt. I don't have an aunt, but all my relatives live far away except for a couple, and they wouldn't travel to see me. Anyway, thank you. I want to tell you a little bit about myself first, and then I have a couple of themes that I want to address. And if they don't happen to jive with what you want to hear, there's going to be plenty of room for you to redirect me and put me on track to whatever you want to talk about, because, of course, I'm here in person so that you can ask me questions. But a little bit about myself. I was born in Poland in 1953, making me 69, almost 70. Eek. And I had a very patterned life. I traveled back and forth between Poland and New York, and back to Poland, back to the United States, quite a lot. And that is very unusual for a person who was born in Poland after the war. There's a reason for it. My father worked for the United Nations, and so we moved with him and then moved back to Poland. That has given me a perspective that I think is unique on both Polish life, but specifically on Polish life, how an American would regard it. And that's one of the reasons why I thought deeply early on about writing about my experiences in Poland, targeting an American audience, because I know the kind of reactions I tend to get when I talk about coming from Poland, and I want to a little bit explore that with you, what it means to travel back and forth in the way that I did. I eventually settled in the United States. It's all in the book, but the book, I have to say, covers only the first 18 years of my life. It stops at the moment when I decide to move back to the United States and stay here for good. And I think I explain a little bit what were the questions in my mind and what were the reasons why I decided to make the move in the end. Then eventually whether to stay or not in the United States, again, I had firm ties to Poland, but you go to school here, or I finished the university here, and I met someone, and I got married, and I started the family, and boom, I'm an American. I have moved to Madison. Eventually, I moved to Madison, and I took on a teaching job at UW. I'm a law professor, and I taught law for 25 years. And so that absolutely makes me a Wisconsinite, even though Wisconsin is one of the few states where whenever I'm among people from Wisconsin, they always tell me, oh, you have a really interesting accent. Where do you come from? I never get that anywhere else. I mean, I always find it funny that people here have such an ear, and they note right away that I wasn't born here. I'm not one who always has lived here, but I really regard myself now as a Wisconsinite. Okay, so that's me. You know, already more than the people who just read the book, because people who just read the book, we stop at 18 years, that's it. There are several goals, like I said, that I have for us tonight, and one of them has to do not with my background in Poland or in my childhood or any of that, but what it's like to write a memoir, because I always think that people are walking around thinking about this and hesitating a little bit and wondering if it's something that they want to engage in. And I, like I said, I think of myself as, to some degree, having been writing for a very long time in my life. You know, I was one of those kids who started keeping a journal at age 11, and then I got really into it when I was a teenager. All my angst and pathos are immersed in thousands of pages about the boyfriend who didn't like me, and so some of that is actually in the book too. So I wrote a lot in that style for a while, but it became clear to me that I wanted to write something serious about growing up in Poland. Post-war Poland is, you know, I don't think of myself as having had an interesting life. I'm not a remarkable person in any fashion, but I did live in interesting times in an interesting place. And I think if I can say anything about Poland after the war, if I can put some questions into people's minds about what it's like to live under so-called communism, I think I will have done my job with writing this down. I wasn't altogether sure I could pull off a memoir, so I started writing short stories about 15 years ago, and I decided I really liked it, and I really liked the nonfiction format, and so I plunged. 15 years ago, I started writing this thing. 15 years it took me to finish it. True, there were some pauses. The grandchildren were born. I got engaged in that, and I put it aside for a while. And in that time, in the 15 years, my ideas about what I'm doing and how I'm presenting the text really, really evolved. I mean, things happened in this country and things happened in Poland, political things, that made me absolutely certain that I needed to be clear and honest in the way that I presented my stuff, especially about Poland. And so I did a lot of clarifying, changing, rewriting. I cannot tell you how many times I rewrote paragraphs, particularly ones that had to do with the politics of Poland. And I just wanted to not err in making statements that were in some way inaccurate or tainted by some preconceptions that I had. So there was that. So it took a long time to get this thing done. I finally finished it last year. It got published in June. But then, too, it's a lot about family. I mean, it's a story about a kid growing up in Poland. There was a mother and a father and a sister, and there were friends, and a lot of them are still alive right now. I felt very, very responsible about introducing them into the text. People's families are complicated. You always probably think you have the weirdest family on the planet. Well, it happens that we all do. And we have characters and we have people doing things that are unusual and extraordinary. And I wanted to present them honestly. I asked friends whose names I used, particularly one who was my boyfriend, or whom I wanted to be my boyfriend. I asked him if it's okay to use his name, but otherwise I was really honest. I didn't change any names. And I know that it involved real people. My mother, by the way, my father died several years ago, but my mother's still alive, and she lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and she's 99 years old. And she reads my blog every day, and it scares the daylights out of me. She's not on YouTube right now. I can say a lot. But anyway, and so I was very, very aware of the fact that she too would be reading the book, and she did. And it took her a day or two to like it, but now she really likes it, in the same way that it took her 5 years or more to like my blog, but now she really likes it. But you have to think about all these things, and I didn't when I started, but I thought a lot about them as I went on. One thing that I hope I accomplished with this memoir, and I don't know that everybody aims to do that, but I sure did. I wanted to put forth the facts as I recalled them. I have people have told me this, I have a really excellent memory for detail, and particularly detail of my childhood. And so I presented that. I really tried hard to skip the judgment. I didn't really attempt or want to say this was wrong, this was right, this felt that way, this felt that way. That was not for me to do. I wanted to leave that to the reader. So that's the memoir stuff. Now, what was the goal of writing it? I already said I wanted to explain life in post-war Poland. But as I went on to write it, I realized that people in Poland would always also be reading it, and people in Poland right now are very conflicted. You think we have a torn society now that is strictly divided along political lines. It is equally divided, perhaps, if not more so, in Poland. And so me writing about my life under communism with a father who, if you will read the book, eventually was employed by the Communist Party. He was not only a member, but he actually worked for the Communist Party. I knew that this would actually lead to a lot of raised eyebrows and a lot of side commentary. I'm aware of that. Nonetheless, I thought it was a good enough story for me to put down on paper so that you would also kind of think about under what circumstances people make the choices that they do. Why, what ideas, what ideals, what hopes lead them to form allegiances. Other themes, though, did emerge as I progressed with the writing, and one important theme that I think of and I thought a lot about was about the feelings of an outsider, how a person can feel that they are different from the rest of the community. When you're growing up, and again, this is a story about childhood, you want to be like your friends. You really want to be like your friends. That's your goal in life. You don't care about anything except that you are not regarded as different. Now, this is a challenge for me because I was born in Poland, and I am a non-Catholic in a country that, at the time that I was born, saw itself as being 98, 99% Catholic. I was really actually stunned to see, this was after World War II. The Jews were either killed or they had immigrated out of Poland, most of them. And the remaining religious minorities were so small that they were not even part of the statistical count. So most people identified themselves as Catholic. They still do. I read just several months ago that 97% of Poles view themselves as Catholic. That's huge. And I'm not even sure that it says anything about church attendance or adherence to the Catholic principles of religion and life, but they identify themselves as Catholic, and I never did. So already from the get-go, I was an outsider. I never did because my parents were not, or at least my father was not, and my mother was really not either. So that made me really, really different. I was given the name of Nina by a stubborn mother who decided she wanted to name her daughter not after a saint, but just give her a name that she liked, that could be translated easily into a bunch of languages. And she was not given permission to do so. 1953, why? Because there was no recognized Saint Nina, and he had to be named after a saint. And so I was nameless while she bickered back and forth. My mom doesn't shy away from stating her opinions, never did, still doesn't. And so she prevailed, and so I became Nina. Subsequently, I found out there actually is a Saint Nina, and now it appears in calendars. And I could have had a name day, like all my friends, but I didn't. I had to celebrate my birthday, the one kid in the class who didn't have a name day, to get chocolates from her friends. Anyway, so that was one already unique way that I was a little bit on the periphery of what was going on in Poland. But also, I traveled. I mean, I left Poland to go to New York when I was 7 years old because my father was appointed to the United Nations in a very prominent position. Most kids couldn't travel abroad. And so I went very quickly when I moved to New York from being a poor kid. We lived in a crummy apartment, 2 tiny rooms, the 4 of us, my sister and my parents, in downtown Warsaw in a, ugly, ugly stairwell where drunkards urinated, and it was just awful. To suddenly moving to New York, and my dad worked for the United Nations. I mean, I became, with that move, a child of privilege. And it's something that I hope comes through in the book. In that way, I was uniquely privileged in a way that very, very few Poles, and certainly few Polish kids, were. I could go abroad. I traveled back. Suddenly, my family had dollars, small amount, but $5 in Poland, in post-war Poland, could go a huge way because currency from the West was not something that was made available to Polish people. So I became a child of privilege. But too, in that way I was different. But too, also, when I was living in New York for the 6 years that my dad worked for the UN, I sure learned how to be an outsider. This was at a time when anti-communism was going strong. And I was from Poland. There were a lot of immigrants from Poland in the United States, but none of them were going back to Poland. They had escaped Poland and intended to stay here. I stayed here, and we went back. And I had no doubts about it, and I loved my country, and I wanted to go back. My friends would be in Poland. My grandparents lived in Poland. I was Polish. So this is something that I do write about in the book, which is the felt, and I start actually with a chapter where I'm in New York and living as a commie kid at a time where being a commie kid was not a cool thing. I mean, I always say this, and people are surprised about this, that there was a year where, in 1964, I think, where anti-communist feelings were so strong in the government and among the people that all states were able to enact communist-free zones where we were not permitted to travel through them. Every single state had such a region. So suddenly, for 1 year, we went to Lake George in New York for spring break, and next year we're not allowed there because they decided to declare themselves to be a communist-free zone, and so they wanted to keep the likes of me out. There was only one state in the whole United States that didn't have a communist-free zone which we could travel through freely, and it was shockingly, maybe, I don't know, not shockingly, the state of Georgia. We could go anywhere we wanted to in Georgia. And I remember we always took winter breaks in Florida. I mean, who doesn't, right? We lived in New York. We drove down to Florida, and we had to do this little zigzag because, you know, there's the base there with a space industry, and there are all these places that you just don't want anyone coming near them who looks like they're from Poland. So that was kind of a unique experience. And then too, I moved back to Poland as a teenager, having lived in America. Who does that, right? I mean, I was a very, very unusual child in my high school class, in a school which was, of course, full of 100% Polish kids. And then there comes this kid who spent all this time in America. I mean, I had, again, the privilege of having 6 Beatle albums. I mean, I was popular for my Beatle albums, if nothing else, because it was something that you couldn't have. And so, again, quite a lot of differences. Still, I faced a lot of anti-sentiments both here and in Poland, anti-Polish here, anti-communist, and when I was in New York, and then anti-capitalist. I studied economics at the University of Warsaw. You know, our first semester was the economics of socialism, and then the next semester it was the economics of capitalism, and you can imagine which one was the favored system. And then too, in the 60s, I faced my family. Well, we're not Jewish, but we dealt with strong feelings of anti-Semitism in Poland. Then the political tides were such that this forced my father out of foreign service. He didn't want to have to do anything to do with the people who are really, really using anti-Semitism as a way to strengthen their own position of power. I write about this here. And two, a lot of feelings of hatred towards the Soviet Union for those who are especially not in power and not puppets of the Soviet system. There was then, there is now, and there will be for the rest of my life a lot of very strong feelings that are targeted against the Russian people and against the Soviet Union. Again, I explore a little bit of it now. So, you know, if you think you're living at a time of hatred, hatred is not new. It's been with us, and I sure have felt it as a kid. And so now here I want to say just a few things about the fact that this is a book about childhood. I hope that I can write clearly about what it's like to evolve and develop political beliefs when you're growing up at a time also of great political upheaval. You know, I left New York to go back to Poland in 1966 during the Vietnam War debate, a time of protest. And then here I am in Poland, and we're hitting another huge transition where there was at first, after the war, there was a puppet government aligned with the Soviet Union. Then it became a less closed, less insular government, and we're hoping that there would be more of an open society, westernization, as it were, closer ties with countries in Western Europe. And then things started to change again for the worse in the 60s, which triggered student protests in 1968, and a very real threat of Soviet invasion. Yeah, I should have picked that as a paragraph to read for you. I will read a paragraph. But the 68 was a traumatic year for us, I think, in Poland, because the invasion did happen in Czechoslovakia to the south of us, and we thought we were next. At the same time that, you know, students were out in the streets. This in Europe in 1968 was a year of student protest everywhere, but also in Poland. And so I want you to know, as you're reading it, how a child fares at a time when all this is happening. Because kids are really born uninformed, right? Where do they get their knowledge from? This was, to me, a huge theme. What my parents chose to share with me, what they didn't, what I had to learn from friends, what I had to learn the hard way. You know, I write about why and how I joined the youth socialist movement, not knowing anything about it. and then why I backed away from it. So this, you form your ideas by looking and listening to what's around you. But what if not very many people are speaking honestly about what's going on? Where do you get your knowledge from? So this is a theme that I think comes out, I hope, comes out throughout the whole book. And finally, lastly, immigration. I am an immigrant. There's no doubt about that. But we have this sort of one vision of what immigration is that people move from one country and then they settle into the next country and then they stay there. That's not how it worked for us, and I dare say it's not how it works for a lot of people. I came back to the United States, as I said, later on. I was 18 years when I came back, and I came back as an au pair. I worked for a wealthy family. I was a babysitter, nanny kind of person, and I wasn't sure I'd stay. It was just a summer job, but after that summer, I was invited to stay and study in New York. And I loved that idea. I loved New York's pluralism, the openness of that society was something that I relished. And so I end the book with that. But it's not a straight immigrant story because, as it turns out, my mother had already in her childhood traveled to America several times. And in fact, she lived and got her high school education in New York because my grandfather came to the United States to escape the tyranny and the oppression of the non-existent Poland before World War I. And then he went back to Poland. And then he brought his family. And so he came back to Detroit and New York. And then he went back because he was unemployed. And then he came back. So he was going back and forth trying to establish himself somewhere with his family. And as a result, my mother was, as it turned out, American. She grew up in America, but then in 1948, she met my father in Washington, D.C. He was in the diplomatic service. She was there working as a secretary. They went back to Poland to build the new Poland together. And then my grandparents came back. And then, so here I am. My uncle is in California. My mother is in Madison. My father died in Poland. My sister lives in Warsaw. And so we're all spread out. And we've been traveling back and forth like this, it seems, all our lives. Now, I feel, as I said before, I feel very much like I am American. My identity, my commitment, my work, my kids, I admit, don't even speak Polish. My grandchildren have never been to Poland, even though I go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It is interesting how you form your identities. I'm American, and yet there's a lot of Europe still in me. And my father, toward the end of his life, used to say, I'm a citizen of the world, darn it, I cannot, don't ask me anymore. And I sort of kind of thought, gee, Dad, I always thought you were more Polish, and I thought my mother was a little more American. And I was surprised that he, too, struggled into his 80s with really understanding where his true identity, where it emerged, what formed him, who he was. So with that brief introduction, I was going to read you just a paragraph because I was told I did one other book reading and I didn't read anything, and I really got wrapped for that one. So I decided, okay, fine. Even though reading my own text seems kind of strange, but I'm going to put you right back in 1968. I'm a teenager. I'm back in Poland, and I'm going to high school now in Poland, and trying to understand what's going on around me. And I tell you, it's 1968. So you remember, this is a really, really very traumatic year for Poland, for a lot of Poles. And I don't really know what's going on. I just know that there's a lot of protest and a lot of stuff going on. And we also know, of course, that we dislike a lot of the elements in the Polish government, particularly those who support our alliance with the Soviet Union. But anyway, so one especially windy afternoon, I walk home from school the long way, past the market and the bakery on Polna Street, where I occasionally stopped to pick up warm, freshly baked bread. I buttoned my sweater. I hadn't taken a heavier coat, believing that we were at the heels of spring. This was in March. I wait in line for the bread, and after paying for it and breaking off the end piece for a snack. That's what we used to do, break off the przylepki and eat, and we walked home. I made my way toward ulica Nowowiejska, the street where we first lived when I moved to Warsaw at the age of 3. I spent the first 3 years with my grandparents in the deep country. No electricity, no plumbing, nothing. Deep country. I'm about to cross Nowowiejska so I can veer right and make my way toward home when I see people running. I'm by the Politechnika, the engineering school of Warsaw. Students with coats flying are scampering across the street, darting between buildings like mice released in a city of cats. So this is the protest that we have been hearing about. I come closer that I can watch. Though I know few details of their demands, I am rooting for the demonstrators. In my mind, there are no complexities here. It seems obvious that the student concerns are legitimately felt, and it is equally obvious that their voices are not being recognized. So as I stand there facing the Politechnika building, mulling things over in my own framework of right and wrong, a militiaman chasing a student looks over his shoulder and sees me. Perhaps out of frustration or because he is in a stage of rage, he rushes at me with his club and strikes me hard several times across my back. I'm completely taken by surprise. I fall forward, then quickly get up and start running. He chases me, repeatedly striking at me from behind. I outrun him. Or maybe he decides it's time to move on to someone else. I continue running home, sobbing now. I'm in 68, so I'm 15 years old, not quite, 14, 15. All the way to up the stairs to our apartment. As I let the door fly open, I careen straight into my mother. What's the matter? Did something happen to you? I got beaten up by a militiaman. What? What were you doing? Wow. I was just standing at the side, nothing really, watching. My back is sore and I'm tired from running. I wipe my nose and my eyes and I look at her, at my mother, my mamusha, hoping a little girl's hope that she can say the good words. The militia officers didn't mean it. He made a terrible mistake and we'll make it right. It won't happen again. But how can she? It's not true. And it is not in her nature to load color on a blustery black and white March day. She picks up the phone and calls my father. We're going to the doctor, she tells me. I want your back examined. I want there to be a record of this. I tell her I'll be fine, but we go to the clinic anyway. The doctor looks at me, listens to my mother's rage, and says calmly and quietly, just a little sore, a little bruised. She'll be all right. She's lucky. Some of the other students, good young people, did not get away so easily from the brutality. Why did this happen? I now have a reason to confront my father with questions about the protests when he comes home from work. But his answer is brief. This is how they deal with protest. In their eyes, you were one of the oppositions. And then I go on to discuss it a little bit more. That was a fragment of the story, and it gets possibly a little bit at the confusion that I felt, and I explore it much, much, much more deeply as I continue to speculate with my friends and with others what it is that's going on in the country and how it is affecting the people. And two, how is it that my parents got so close to the system that clearly does so much horrible stuff to its own people. And I hope that you get a better understanding of what Poland was like when the end of war happened in, obviously, 1945. I lived in the country because my parents both worked, and so my grandparents took care of me. But when I moved back to Warsaw, even in the early 50s, there was so much still rubble from the war. The rebuilding effort was great, but the resources were small. Warsaw was totally destroyed during the war, and we really are of the generation that can't ever not think about that. I remember when I first came from my school in New York, which was the United Nations International School, la-di-da, everybody's friendly, everybody is just getting along. And then I moved to Warsaw and went to high school there. And the stark contrast is the classroom, which has in Poland none of this like colorful stuff everywhere, just desks, rows of desks. And then there was just one sign that said, Nigdy więcej, which means never again. And it meant, of course, everybody knew what it meant. It meant no more war. We can never have a war like this again. So it was on everybody's mind all the time, perhaps not all the time, but it's something that we didn't forget. And growing up in Poland, you think a lot about the effects of war, and it's tragic, absolutely tragic that we're now still thinking about war in Europe. That is, for my generation, it's incomprehensible that we should have come full circle to being in a position of fear against invaders. So anyway, so that's a little bit of my story, but I want to give you time to ask questions about anything at all. I mean, I'm yours for tonight. You made the effort to come here. Please don't hesitate to ask anything that pops into your head. Anybody? Yes?
There were a lot of extermination and concentration camps in Poland. How did that affect the Polish experience afterward?
Yeah, well, everybody made a visit, of course. In my generation, we were, of course, my father was in Warsaw during the war, and he got lucky, and I talk a little bit about that, and that's not he nor his brother died, but of course the extermination camps were for Jewish people, but not only for Jewish people, for Poles. So there were millions of 6 million Jews, 4 million Poles that died, and we all have visions of Oświęcim, Majdanek. Those are all names that are so familiar to us. And I have to admit that I never made that pilgrimage. I find it too hard. I've watched, it's not that I avoid the topic. My young daughters were reading about World War II when they were still in elementary school. There are a lot of good books actually for kids about this. I don't avoid the topic, but there's only so much emotional bandwidth that I have. I can't really fathom the horrors that took place there. It's still, to me, something that is beyond description. And I think most the Poles, actually, certainly those that are my friends and colleagues in Poland, have a deep understanding of what happened in the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. When I was in high school, we went to do social work. We always have to do social work, and my task was to clean up in the Jewish ghetto. We were creating a park there, and the high school kids had to go and clean up some territory or other. It's amazing that there's no sign of anything there at all of what took place, of what was there. There's a lot of erasing now going on of what happened in Warsaw and happened in other places. Every country wants to move on, and yet we really can't. It's all on a lot of it is on the territory of Poland. Poles have a really, really heavy sense of burden, I guess is maybe one right word for it. They feel themselves to be traumatized repeatedly historically. Poland didn't exist for many years in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century because it was taken over by the three powers that surrounded it. So there was no Poland on the map. That's still in people's consciousness. That gives rise to a hefty amount of Polish pride, sometimes touched with the nationalism that is that's hard to understand for outsiders and sometimes hard to actually even understand for insiders. But that whole history between what happened prior to World War I and then what happened during the Second World War, who came to Poland's aid, what was the role of the Soviet Union in this, what happened at the borders, a lot of it was really glossed over and hidden. A lot of people feel that there's a lot of history that has yet to be told, and we don't know where the truth lies. There's a feeling of perhaps secrecy still about the roles of Polish people in what happened to many those who were deported to the concentration camps. So it's this is not your light-hearted nation that seems to be slated to be forever on a future of promise and optimism. We get a lot of knocks in Poland, and they're still happening right now. So. And it's a very convoluted answer to your question, but I appreciate it because I don't know that we can ever get away from thinking about those camps. This is certainly not in my generation. Yes.
This is kind of off the wall, but what is the relationship between the Polish and the Ukrainians?
And the Ukrainians?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, what is the relationship between the Polish people and the Ukrainians? And it's interesting. My grandma was born in a place that is now part of the Ukraine, but she was born in 1901. And at that time, there was no Poland there, but she considered herself to be Polish. A lot of people that lived there. It was in Lvov, and so it was part Polish, part Ukrainian, part Russian. And then with a rearrangement of the borders, that part became Poland. Part of the territory where she was from became Poland, but Lvov, of course, remained with the Ukraine. She went back to visit the Ukraine to see if any of her Polish family connections were there. No, they were all gone. They'd moved back to Poland. On the other hand, there were the Ukrainians and the Russians. A significant minority of Russian populations did exist there. Poland has had a difficult relationship with the Soviet Union. Ukraine was, of course, part of the Soviet Union. It has a more, I'd say, complicated relationship with the Ukraine prior to the war with Russia because the Ukrainian nation, as one that was regarded as slightly poorer than Poland, a lot of people came from the Ukraine to work in Poland. It's the same way that we get Latin American, Mexican people coming to the United States in search of a better life, so too millions of Ukrainians, even before the war, came to Poland. If you ask anybody in Warsaw and they have a maid, she's going to be Ukrainian. And it's all the jobs that cannot be filled by people who aspire to a higher salary are filled by Ukrainians. And so we really depended on them for labor, and they depended on us for employment. Ukrainians learned Polish very quickly and very well. And so the languages are such that I can sort of a little bit understand Russian, actually, and Ukrainian. And so the language barrier isn't as extreme. And so a lot of the Ukrainian people did come to Poland and establish firm roots in Poland prior to the invasion by Russia to the Ukrainian society. At the same time, the Ukraine was a complicated country before the invasion. It was not all good people doing good things. So there was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of political upheaval and turmoil. And so we were always quite aware of that. There was a government for a while that was certainly not one that we supported. But then everything changed with the invasion by the Russians. and I mean even earlier by the invasion in Crimea and even before this last February, because suddenly they really did, it became clear that they were our friends and allies. And together we were really aligned against the invading forces of Russia. So, you know, our feelings about the Ukraine, at the beginning, we were all a confused mixture of people moving between two countries that were just changing borders constantly. And then we moved on to a period where there was a little bit of a backing away, maybe because there was corruption, there was political corruption, but at the same time, economic interdependence. And now there's more of an alignment with the Ukrainian people, but the longer that the war goes on, the more difficult that is going to become, because, as it turns out, a lot of the Ukrainians that are moving to Poland, there are a lot of very poor people, but there are also those who want to take advantage of the situation and the war and move their fortunes to, even though they're not impoverished, move their fortunes to Poland, take advantage of the war to their betterment. So it gets complicated. It gets really complicated. But overall, I would say that Poland and the Ukraine share a friendly border and a friendly relationship. We certainly don't feel threatened in Poland by the Ukrainians in the way that we feel threatened by the Russians. Yeah. Yes?
We have a question from online, which is, how did you come up with the title for your book?
Very, very interesting question. Oh, yeah, how did I come up with Like a Swallow? Well, I like swallows, and I had a very, very close relation to my grandparents, with whom I spent the first 3 years of my life, and they had swallows darting in and out of the house all the time. But it really, that's not where the title comes from. When I like to strum the guitar. When I came to the United States, my parents needed to send me and my sister away from the city, so they sent me to camp. And I learned to strum the guitar, and I loved it. And one of the songs that I learned was Donna Donna. Do you know it? You know, there's a wagon bound for market. There's a calf with a mournful eye. High above him, there's a swallow winging swiftly across the sky. How the winds are laughing, they laugh with all their might, laugh and laugh the whole day through and half the summer night. And then it goes on, the verse goes on to say, cows are easily bound and slaughtered, never knowing the reason why, but whoever treasures freedom like a swallow has learned to fly. And I actually thought that this was an American folk song. It actually is Joan Baez sang it, and so Joan Baez was my hero. And so I thought, oh, well, when my friends in Poland, when I went back to Poland and I was in high school, and we always sang around the campfire. That's what Polish people do. They sing a lot around the campfire. And so, they still do. And so we would have campfires with my high school friends, and eventually somebody would pass me the guitar and say, sing us an American song. And that's the one that they liked the most, because they could sing along, Donna, 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 Donna. So it was a very popular song. But of course, it's the text that gets me each time. I mean, I'm a person of flight, you could say. And I'm one who moved a lot in my life, so that's the obvious association that I have with the theme of flight. But it also is at a deeper level, I hope, maybe only I have thought of this, but I sure do. My father was, as I said, born and raised in Poland, and he was in high school when the war started. And he never wanted to be a diplomat, he wanted to be a doctor. But then the war started, and they had underground schools, and then the war ended. He was finishing his high school education, and suddenly medicine seemed remote, and so his mother said, here, I found online, not online, but whatever, this diplomacy school, you should go. And He did, and you know, it was a two-month course in diplomacy or whatever, and then he joined the Foreign Service. And his parents were sort of communists in that they weren't Russian communists. There's a difference, but they certainly believed in the idea of socialism and communism. And I think my father did too, particularly after the war had destroyed Poland. I mean, I know my father did too. And so he joined the Foreign Service, which was part of the government, and he was proud of the work of the government, the work that it did in rebuilding Poland, in providing free education, free health care to all. And he was really, really hopeful that this was the future of the country. It became very clear very quickly. I mean, and he had no illusions about who Stalin was and what the Soviet Union was doing. That was, you know, that was enemy, big time enemy. But at the same time, he thought Poland could accomplish something going in this direction, which was forced upon Poland. It's not Polish people didn't choose socialism; it was thrust upon them in the division that happened. You know, you all know Yalta and everything that happened there. But he was hopeful, but he had to adjust. He had to adjust quickly because the government flopped and flipped in various directions, and he needed to find, once he had embarked on this career, he needed to find a place for himself and support his family, and that was always in his head. How am I going to manage this, given what's going on in Poland? So when he was at the United Nations, he knew it was a limited term, but he already was thinking ahead. What am I going to do after this? How am I going to find a place for my family and for myself? He was always, in my mind, in flight mode, and trying to figure out how to. And he was unemployed for a period of time too, so that was tough for him. And he was not a dedicated father, you know, by no means. He was, you know, his mind was on his work, and he did adjust, and he did survive, and he provided for his family. That was his goal, and he managed it. But you had to think on your toes when you lived in a country that was undergoing the changes that Poland was undergoing after the war, and he did a lot of that. So I have to give him credit for that. Anything else? Somebody else? Yes, George.
Was there ever a time when you came back to the United States when you're still young, where you were interacting with Americans your age, where they said to you, you're brainwashed, and you said to them, you're indoctrinated? Was there ever one of those clashes?
Yeah, I mean, I always secretly thought that. You know, I always thought that people here were completely brainwashed. There's, you know, there are a couple of paragraphs in here where I address that directly. When you know, even when I was a kid still going to school in New York, I routinely would get these people would ask me these questions and say to me, "Oh, is it true that they stand with guns outside your classroom and make sure that you're saying the right words?" You know, and this kind of questioning about, and I had this teacher, and this was at the UN school. This like drove my father nuts when I told him, and then he forgot about it. Thank God. You hate it when your parents intervene into your school life. But anyway, when I had this teacher in 4th grade, 5th grade, who, you know, somebody raises their hand and says, Mrs. Inez, that was her name, Mrs. Inez, why is it that people here hate communists so much? And Mrs. Inez said, well, how would you like it if somebody took away all your money? And so this is, you know, UN school teacher with, you know, a commie kid sitting in her class. So that was, and then, you know, there was a classic thing. There was a textbook that we used in social studies, and in it there was a paragraph that said, you know, and people were placed in a long, slow-moving train to Siberia if they expressed their opposition to. One thing that I really, really disliked was that people here always lumped all the Eastern Bloc countries and saw them as one. You know, it's all communist over there. And it's like this is West, and then there's all these communist countries. And there wasn't a whole lot of similarity between Poland and the Soviet Union. There was, you know, we had a gradation. We always thought, rightly, correctly, that East Germany was the most repressive, totalitarian, authoritarian. You can't say boo in that country and without getting in trouble. And also, you know, the people lived in what appeared to us to be, I traveled to East Berlin when I was a kid, and it's just bleak. I mean, it's all the films that you see about communist countries. You need to go to East Berlin, and there you have it. It's that right there. At the same time, you go to Hungary, which was also a communist country, but with great ties with Austria. And Austria was one of the few European countries that didn't require us commies to have a visa to go visit it. One of the reasons you couldn't travel when you lived in Poland was because you couldn't get a visa to the countries that wouldn't really embrace a whole lot of communists coming to visit them. So Budapest in Hungary and Vienna, which are like 100 kilometers apart, are very closely integrated. And we'd go to Budapest, and there would be meat in the stores, and there would be, you know, because it's in the south, it has produce, and it has all these things that Poland lacked. At the same time, Poland was only 30% collectivized. That means our whole rural landscape looked entirely different from other communist countries where it was, you know, in the Soviet Union, it was all under collective ownership. And so you know, when you fly over, even to this day, you fly into Poland, you immediately know when you're over Poland because the land looks like it was divided by the parents, and then the next generation, little tiny strips, like that, because it was private, and it was all that you had was your land and your farm, and it was yours. I mean, I never saw a collective rural enterprise in my whole life, and I lived in the country, in the deep country. It was all privately owned, and so again, Poland was different, and that's why we had hoped that, I think my father's generation had hoped that we would become even looser, more liberal, more closely tied to the West in the way that Hungary had become and Yugoslavia had become more closely tied to the West, and not like East Germany, to give an example, or the Soviet Union. So there was that. I mean, there was this, to me, I was always trying to shoot down those stereotypes. I mean, you know, I'll never forget when in 1980s it was some colleagues from UW, friends of ours, traveled to Poland for the first time. So it was a big deal to go to Poland. You know, still communists then. And then they came back and said, "Oh, we have all these pictures we want to look at together and show you, you know, we took from our travels to Warsaw." And then they showed, like, you know, what to them was, this is Poland, you know, the broken benches, the sort of dismal entrance, you know, like in New York you have these doormen and these big, you know, awnings over entrance to buildings. In Warsaw, the entrance to apartment buildings is sort of like to the side, and they're smelly and they're dark and they're horrible. And so he took a lot of pictures of this and said, "Oh, here, look, and this and that." And I thought, you know, is that all you can see? Is really, honestly, that's all you saw from your trip to Poland? I was near tears. And so to me, that kind of one monochromatic image of a country, and you know, and I say also, though, from the flip side, Poles love Americans. They love Americans, and they still love Americans. I mean, it's a country that can do no wrong, almost. I mean, they don't much like the violence in schools here. You know, a little bit kind of terrified as to what we're doing with violence on the streets. But they love Americans. You know, I can't say that it was reciprocated. You know, I come back to Poland, and, you know, tell us about what was it like in America. Play us an American song, and yeah, by the way, can we borrow? And biggest thrill was when, in 1967, I guess it was, the Rolling Stones came to Poland. It was the first group that made it to Poland behind Iron Curtain. I mean, and then, of course, nobody could get tickets, and they were distributed to party officials, which is why I sat in row 3 of the auditorium with my sister, and we were going, "Yay, Ruby Tuesday!" And everybody is just like sitting stiffly. And and this is my embarrassing story of my childhood, which is that I was 14 then, not even quite 14, and I was so thrilled. And I bought a little bunch of flowers, and I wrote a little note. "You might want to talk to someone, English-speaking person, call me," and I threw it. And I waited by the phone for a little while. I didn't have much hope, but I thought maybe, you're a kid. You're a kid. But no, I was in a country that. And two, there are a lot of Poles living in America, and so you go south in Poland, in the mountainside, in the mountains of Poland. There are so many families that immigrated from there to Chicago, to other places, to Buffalo, everywhere, and so there's a lot of good feeling and sympathy toward those relatives who send back these incredible presents. And my mother, when we traveled back to Poland when we were in New York for 6 years. We went back to Poland every couple of years for the summer. And she would bring presents. And I remember once she brought this purple bathroom mat. I don't know what struck her to do that, but anyway, for one of her friends. And the woman put it in her living room. It was like, wow, thank you so much. And I always, when my parents' friends went to New York after we moved back, I always asked for the same thing. Do you want anything? They're willing to bring you something from the United States. The latest Beatles album and a tube of Clearasil. I had terrible acne, and I didn't think the Polish people knew how to deal with it very well. I was happy. But and it's very interesting, for all the horror that Poles still have towards the violence that takes place often in the streets here. When I lived in Poland, and this is still pretty much true. I would walk around the streets of Warsaw, 2 o'clock at night by myself and feel perfectly safe. I mean, there was no fear. We all lived with our parents until God knows when, way too long probably, because we couldn't get apartments. And I say this more about my friends because I moved out when I was 18 and I left. But everybody lived with their parents, but they had a lot more independence than American kids do. In high school already, we took trips, high school pack of kids, friends. We went to the mountains for 5 days, a week, 2 weeks by ourselves. We found a place to stay. We'd ski, meaning we'd put on, and go up the hill like that, and then go down, and then go up the hill like that, and no ski lifts then. And we had a ton of independence. We just roamed the streets. We took the trains where nobody had a car. I mean, certainly none of my friends had cars. So we were freer in that sense, very limited sense, where I realized we're not free in very many ways. And travel abroad was one of the big obstacles to so many people. Again, couldn't get a visa. Could get a passport easier than could get a visa. Any other questions? Anybody have anything else that they're curious about? Yes?
I'm just curious if you've seen the film Cold War. It came out in 2018, but it's on streaming services now, and it's about growing up in Poland in the 1950s.
Cold War, growing up in 1950s, you would think that I wrote it, let alone saw it. And I'm going to say that I don't understand why it doesn't ring a bell to me, but I'm gonna look it up. I'm trying to imagine that it's not that I'm so old that I saw it and don't remember it. There's a slight, tiny possibility of that, but it is. I mean, there were some films that came out recently that were about Did you see it, by the way? Yes. It's not the one about the folk singing group. Yeah. That's it. Okay, so I did see it. Okay. Yes, I have seen it, and yeah, that is. It's a beautiful movie, and a lot of I know. This is about a group, a folk group that was established in Poland of musicians, of singing musicians, and they sang. It was a brilliant idea that somebody had of establishing this group called Mazowsze, and then the Śląsk, another one, and they traveled all over the world singing Polish folk songs, or at least they were based on melodies from Polish folk songs, and to get into this group. You had to be a good dancer and a good singer, and you had to be pretty, and you wore a Polish costume, and you danced and you sang. And they traveled all over the world, especially to countries like America and others where there were Polish communities. And I saw them when they came to New York. We all cry because it was all so nostalgic and reminded us of our home. But it also provided an opportunity for some of them to jump ship and stay abroad. And so this is a story about how that can happen, what that can do to your life if you decide to jump ship. What if you have family behind? What if you have a loved one behind? Can you come back? Can you be accepted? Will you ruin the future and the life of those that you left behind by jumping ship? So that's a theme of escaping from a country and finding yourself to be, as a horrible ending. I just remember that ending. Oof. But what it can do to you, but also to the people that you love, that you've left behind, and that there's in a sense there is no good future for you, even if you do find a future for yourself. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, everybody. If you want to buy a copy, I do have 4 books left in my stash. You're welcome to them at a discount too, no less. But of course, otherwise you can borrow them from the library because it is in the library, and that's absolutely for free. Thank you so much for coming on this cold day. I so appreciated you as an audience. You're great, and I look forward to hearing from some of you over the years, and you know that you can find me on my blog always. Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay. Come here, you friend.
Thank you for putting that
I cannot believe you drove all the way up here.
Hi. Of course I would drive all the way. I'm just glad I could.
Sweetest person
Tom
on the
wanted
planet.
to, but he was biking.